I'm going to read The Day the Dam Broke, Chapter 3 of My Life and Hard Times by James Thurber. James Grover Thurber, born 1894, died 1961. My Life and Hard Times was first published in 1933. This material is okay to be listened to by children. Chapter 3, The Day the Dam Broke. My memories of what my family and I went through during the 1913 flood in Ohio, I would gladly forget. And yet neither the hardships we endured, nor the turmoil and confusion we experienced, can alter my feeling toward my native state and city. I am having a fine time now, and wish Columbus were here, but if anyone ever wished a city was in hell, it was during that frightful and perilous afternoon in 1913, when the dam broke. Or to be more exact, when everybody in town thought that the dam broke. We were both ennobled and demoralized by the experience. Grandfather especially rose to magnificent heights which can never lose their splendor for me, even though his reactions to the flood were based upon a profound misconception, namely that Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry was the menace we were called upon to face. The only possible means of escape for us was to flee the house, a step which grandfather sternly forbade. Brandishing his old army saber in his hand, "Let the sons come," he roared. Meanwhile, hundreds of people were streaming by our house in wild panic, screaming, "Go east! Go east!" We had to stun grandfather with the ironing board. Impeded as we were by the inert form of the old gentleman, he was taller than 6 feet and weighed almost 170 pounds, we were passed, in the first half-mile, by practically everyone else in the city. Had grandfather not come to at the corner of Parsons Avenue and Town Street, we would unquestionably have been overtaken and engulfed by the roaring waters. That is, if there had been any roaring waters. Later, when the panic had died down and people had gone rather sheepishly back to their homes and their offices, minimizing the distances they had run and offering various reasons for running, city engineers pointed out that even if the dam had broken, the water level would not have risen more than 2 additional inches in the west side. The west side was, at the time of the dam scare, under 30 feet of water, as indeed were all Ohio river towns during the great spring floods of 20 years ago. The east side, where we lived and where all of the running occurred, had never been in any danger at all. Only a rise of some 95 feet could have caused the flood waters to flow over High Street, the thoroughfare that divided the east side of town from the west and engulfed the east side. The fact that we were all as safe as kittens under a cook stove did not, however, assuage in the least the fine despair and the grotesque desperation which seized upon the residents of the east side when the cry spread like a grass fire that the dam had given way. Some of the most dignified, staid, cynical, and clear-thinking men in town abandoned their wives, stenographers, homes, and offices and ran east. There are few alarms in the world more terrifying than "the dam has broken." There are few persons capable of stopping to reason when that clarion cry strikes upon their ears, even persons who live in towns no nearer than 500 miles to a dam. The Columbus, Ohio broken dam rumor began, as I recall it, about noon of March 12, 1913. High Street, the main canyon of trade, was loud with the placid hum of business and the buzzing of placid businessmen, arguing, computing, wheedling, offering, refusing, compromising. Darius Coningway, one of the foremost corporation lawyers in the Middle West, was telling the Public Utilities Commission, in the language of Julius Caesar, that they might as well try to move the Northern Star as to move him. Other men were making their little boasts and little gestures. Suddenly, somebody began to run. It may be that he had simply remembered, all of a moment, an engagement to meet his wife, for which he was now frightfully late. Whatever it was, he ran east on Broad Street, probably toward the Marmore restaurant, a favorite place for a man to meet his wife. Somebody else began to run, perhaps a newsboy in high spirits. Another man, a portly gentleman of affairs, broke into a trot. Inside of 10 minutes, everybody on High Street, from the Union Depot to the courthouse, was running. A loud mumble gradually crystallized into the dread word dam. "The dam has broke!" The fear was put into words by a little old lady in an electric, or by a traffic cop, or by a small boy. Nobody knows who, nor does it now really matter. 2,000 people were abruptly in full flight. "Go east!" was the cry that arose. East away from the river, east to safety. "Go east! Go east! Go east!" Black streams of people flowed eastward down all the streets leading in that direction. These streams, whose headwaters were in the dry goods stores, office buildings, harness shops, movie theaters, were fed by trickles of housewives, children, cripples, servants, dogs, and cats, slipping out of the houses past which the main streams flowed, shouting and screaming. People ran out, leaving fires burning and food cooking and doors wide open. I remember, however, that my mother turned out all the fires, and that she took with her a dozen eggs and 2 loaves of bread. It was her plan to make Memorial Hall, just 2 blocks away, and take refuge somewhere in the top of it, in one of the dusty rooms where war veterans met, and where old battle flags and stage scenery were stored. But the seething throngs shouting "Go East" drew her along, and the rest of us with her. When grandfather regained full consciousness at Parsons Avenue, he turned upon the retreating mob like a vengeful prophet, and exhorted the men to form ranks and stand off the rebel dogs. But at length he too got the idea that the dam had broken, and roaring "Go East" in his powerful voice, he caught up in one arm a small child, and in the other a slight clerkish man of perhaps 42, and we slowly began to gain on those ahead of us. A scattering of firemen, policemen, and army officers in dress uniforms. There had been a review at Fort Hays, in the northern part of town, added color to the surging billows of people. "Go east!" cried a little child in a piping voice, as she ran past a porch on which drowsed a lieutenant colonel of infantry. Used to quick decisions, trained to immediate obedience, the officer bounded off the porch, and, running at full tilt, soon passed the child. Bawling "Go East!" the 2 of them emptied rapidly the houses of the little street they were on. "What is it? What is it?" demanded a fat, waddling man who intercepted the colonel. The officer dropped behind and asked the little child what it was. "The dam has broke," gasped the girl. "The dam has broke," roared the colonel. "Go east! Go east! Go east!" He was soon leading, with the exhausted child in his arms, a fleeing company of 300 persons who had gathered around him from living rooms, shops, garages, backyards, and basements. Nobody has ever been able to compute with any exactness how many people took part in the great rout of 1913, for the panic, which extended from the Winslow Bottling Works in the South End to Clintonville, 6 miles north, ended as abruptly as it began, and the bobtail and ragtag and velvet-gowned groups of refugees melted away and slunk home, leaving the streets peaceful and deserted. The shouting, weeping, tangled evacuation of the city lasted not more than 2 hours in all. Some few people got as far as east as Reynoldsburg, 12 miles away. 50 or more reached the country club, 8 miles away. Most of the others gave up, exhausted, or climbed trees in Franklin Park, 4 miles out. Order was restored and fear dispelled finally by means of militiamen riding about in motor lorries, bawling through megaphones, "The dam has not broken!" At first this tended only to add to the confusion and increase the panic, for many stampeders thought the soldiers were bellowing, "The dam has now broken," thus setting an official seal of authentication on the calamity. All the time the sun shone quietly, and there was nowhere any sign of oncoming waters. A visitor in an airplane, looking down on the straggling, agitated masses of people below, would have been hard put to divine a reason for the phenomenon. It must have inspired, in such an observer, a peculiar kind of terror, like the sight of the Mary Celeste, abandoned at sea, its galley fires peacefully burning, its tranquil decks bright in the sunlight. An aunt of mine, Aunt Edith Taylor, was in a movie theater on High Street when, over and above the sound of the piano in the pit, a W.S. Hart picture was being shown. There rose the steadily increasing tromp of running feet. Persistent shouts rose above the tromping. An elderly man, sitting near my aunt, mumbled something, got out of his seat, and went up the aisle at a dog trot. This started everybody. In an instant the audience was jamming the aisles. "Fire!" shouted a woman, who always expected to be burned up in a theater, but now the shouts outside were louder and more coherent. "The dam has broke!" cried somebody. "Go east!" screamed a small woman in front of my aunt. And east they went, pushing and shoving and clawing, knocking women and children down, emerging finally into the street, torn and sprawling. Inside the theater, Bill Hart was calmly calling some desperado's bluff, and the brave girl at the piano played "Row, row, row" loudly, and then "In My Harem." Outside, men were streaming across the State House yard. Others were climbing trees. A woman managed to get up onto the "These Are My Jewels" statue, whose bronze figures of Sherman, Stanton, Grant, and Sheridan watched with cold unconcern the going to pieces of the capital city. I ran south to State Street, east on State to 3rd, south on 3rd to Town, and out east on Town. My Aunt Edith has written me. A tall, spare woman with grim eyes and a determined chin ran past me down the middle of the street. I was still uncertain as to what was the matter, in spite of all the shouting. I drew up alongside the woman with some effort, for although she was in her late 50s, she had a beautiful, easy running form, and seemed to be in excellent condition. "What is it?" I puffed. She gave me a quick glance, and then looked ahead again, stepping up her pace a trifle. "Don't ask me, ask God," she said. When I reached Grant Avenue, I was so spent that Dr. H.R. Mallory, you remember Dr. Mallory, the man with the white beard who looks like Robert Browning? Well, Dr. Mallory, whom I had drawn away from at the corner of 5th and Town, passed me. "It's got us!" he shouted, and I felt sure that whatever it was did have us, for you know what conviction Dr. Mallory's statements always carried. I didn't know at that time what he meant, but I found out later. There was a boy behind him on roller skates, and Dr. Mallory mistook the swishing of the skates for the sound of rushing water. He eventually reached the Columbus School for Girls, at the corner of Parsons Avenue and Town Street, where he collapsed, expecting the cold, frothing waters of the Scioto to sweep him into oblivion. The boy on the skates swirled past him, and Dr. Mallory realized for the first time what he had been running from. Looking back up the street, he could see no signs of water, but nevertheless, after resting a few minutes, he jogged on east again. He caught up with me at Ohio Avenue, where we rested together. I should say that about 700 people passed us. A funny thing was that all of them were on foot. Nobody seemed to have had the courage to stop and start his car. But as I remember it, all cars had to be cranked in those days, which is probably the reason. The next day the city went about its business as if nothing had happened, but there was no joking. It was 2 years or more before you dared treat the breaking of the dam lightly. And even now, 20 years after, there are a few persons, like Dr. Mallory, who will shut up like a clam if you mention the afternoon of the Great Run.